Hello. So I am so honoured to be here with David Lukoff, Dr. David Lukoff, who is infamous for introducing the category of spiritual and religious problems into the DSM-4. And David is a emeritus professor of psychology and the founder of the Spiritual Emergence Competency Resource Centre, and has written over 80 articles on the topic of spiritual emergence, and has been working in the field for 35 years. And it's such an honour to have you here as part of the campaign, David. I'm so grateful to you. Thank you.
Well, for sure. It's nice to be here and have an opportunity to talk with you about all these issues.
I'm just wondering if you would mind starting by just letting people know a bit about what brought you into this work, and just to give an overview of your own experiences and what kind of led you to an interest in this.
Okay, well, not surprisingly, it was my own lived experience that triggered my interest in this area of spiritual emergencies. And I'm happy to share this story. I did not talk about it at all after it occurred for about 20 years, and then started to, as you would say, come out of the closet about it. Actually, while I was teaching at the California Institute of Integral Studies, some of the students in the class, I was teaching a class on psychopathology, and some of the students in the class shared about their own personal experiences. And I really respect that school for creating an environment where students felt permission to do that. And in that context, I started to share my own story, and that ultimately led to publishing an article on it in 1991, and then starting to give presentations on it at conferences, the American Psychiatric Association conference, I shared my story, the American Psychological Association conference, numerous rehab and recovery conferences, and so on. So my experience occurred in 1971 when I was 23 years old, and I was a graduate student at Harvard in anthropology, and was getting I got my master's degree. This happened just a few months before it, but I was ready to get it and move on to my dissertation. And all of a sudden I had what I would call an existential crisis. I began to really question why I was doing this. As I said, I was 23. I was pretty young to be getting a master's degree and moving on to my dissertation. I objectively think I was making the right assessment in thinking I was really very unworldly. You know, I started to meet all these other graduate students at Harvard who had been around the world and done all this traveling and had other life experiences, and I had lived a very sheltered life. I had been raised in suburbia. My father was a professor. Actually, my grandfather was a professor, so it was kind of in the family, all this PhD professor stuff. And so I began to really question whether this was who I was, or this is what I'd been programmed to do all my life. And even my summer jobs had been at university. So I had really lived a very narrow life. I had never traveled. So I dropped out. I just got rid of everything I owned that wouldn't fit into a backpack and just started to hitchhike around the country, partly because the only thing I knew to do was what I was not doing, you know, just drop out kind of. As part of that, I hitchhiked around the U.S. and Canada and down into Mexico even, and ended up in San Francisco in November of that year. And while I was there, just walking around Golden Gate Park, somebody offered me a tab of LSD. And I had a kind of mantra of this Cat Stevens song called On the Road to Find Out. And here I was doing all these things, you know, sleeping in a sleeping bag on the side of a road, meeting all kinds of people, you know, hitchhiking that I would have never encountered in my previous life. So, I decided to go for it and try it. I had never tried a psychedelic drug. And the next day I took it. And I had this wonderful day walking around Golden Gate Park, going to the ocean and just watching the waves rolling in and realizing I'm part of the ocean and the ocean's in me and all these wonderful kinds of thoughts. And maybe this is time to share that my background was very secular. We were Jewish by birth, but we were never members of a Jewish temple. I didn't know any of the Jewish rituals, prayers, any of that kind of stuff. And would have had no problem describing myself as an atheist and not even that interested in religious and spirit. I didn't even want to particularly debate that. It was just so obvious to me. So anyway, as part of the LSD experience, just walking around, I had all these wonderful nature things, hugging a tree, feeling it breathing, So that night I went to bed and thought, well, that was interesting. I might want to do that again, but it didn't, I didn't feel changed in any way. And then 4 days later, I woke up just to go to the bathroom. I was crashing at an apartment somewhere in the Bay Area. And as I was walking into the bathroom, I looked into the mirror, and all of a sudden, I was holding my hand like this, which I now would call a mudra. I had no idea what that was. And it was glowing. It was giving off a white light. And so immediately I knew what that meant. It meant that I was a reincarnation of Buddha. And right away after that, I had another flash that I was also a reincarnation of Christ. And this is very, very, very naive, but it reflects my level of understanding of the nature of religion at that point in time for me. In my mind, Buddha had created a religion for the East, and Christ had created a religion for the West. And I was going to create my new mission as a reincarnation of them was to create a new religion that would be global, that would include all the people in the world. And so I pulled out my journal that I was keeping and started to write this new holy book. And for the next 5 days, I spent the time working, hardly sleeping, hardly eating, and writing and having conversations with not only Buddha and Christ, but Freud and Jung, and people like Bob Dylan and Cat Stevens, because I felt like, oh, this is a new era, and maybe music would be the way to get this kind of message out. And I'm sorry about that.
It's okay.
And so
music on key.
Yeah, a little music to it. So I, at the end of those 5 days, had my holy book and had a bunch of copies made, about 40 copies as I recall. And then I went to Berkeley, and I viewed Berkeley as kind of like the new Jerusalem, as the new center of the world. And that if I distributed copies there, they would circulate around the world, and it wouldn't be long before people would recognize kind of like this new religion and me as like a messiah for this new religion. So partly because I felt like I had put everything into this book, I didn't need to go around telling people like I'm the new messiah and I'd founded a new religion, because it was all in the book. All people needed to do was read the book. And I'd given away a bunch of copies, mailed some copies to friends and family and stuff. So I just needed to wait. And so during those next 2 months, when I was firmly believing all this, I was very lucky in that I had friends who just let me crash with them. I hitchhiked back to Chicago and then back to the Boston area where I had friends. And for the next 2 months, I crashed on their living room couches. They fed me. I didn't work. I didn't have money. And so I never ended up in the streets. I never ended up hospitalized, medicated, and was able to go through this entire experience as an inner journey. That's how Joseph Campbell talks about it, as an inner hero's journey. And I was able to emerge at the other end 2 months later, kind of with both feet on the ground, and yet quite challenged and mystified by this experience. And I started to do things like read Jung and Joseph Campbell for the first time in my life. And ended up, my parents had a place at the time that was a summer cottage in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. And it really was used like July and August because it had no insulation or anything like that. And this was November. No, this would have been later after that. This would have been March. And so it was still pretty nippy in the Northeast. And I got permission from my parents, though, to go live there. And I lived there, reading more and more about these experiences. And at the same time that I was learning more, and it was really basically validating my experience as something, that wasn't just crazy thinking. I was quite embarrassed about it, and having sent out this book to all these people I knew, setting myself up as a messiah. But I also began to see that it was in a long lineage of people who've had such experiences. There's a book by Richard Buck called Cosmic Consciousness. And so that became kind of my thinking. Oh, that's what I had. I had an experience of cosmic consciousness, which was both validating, but also deflating because it wasn't like I was unique, special, or anything. So I started to really have, a lot of recriminations about that. I started to, question all my decisions. Should I have dropped out of Harvard? And, how foolish this was to have taken LSD and done this and all this kind of stuff. So I started at night to have insomnia and have trouble sleeping. And I developed a recurrence of an illness I had as a kid called Crohn's disease, which is a lot of internal cramping and internal bleeding and pain. And I actually hitchhiked to a free clinic and got some pain medication. That's what they gave me for it. And while I was unable to sleep at night, I started to have fantasies of taking it. My nights were really difficult. I had these images of skeletons, which I took to be my own skeleton, actually, and horrific faces and stuff, kind of coming at me. So it really made it hard to sleep. So I actually seriously considered gulping down this bottle of pills. And that would be a way to attain peace, I thought. I didn't think I would be in heaven or anything, but I thought it would have a peaceful end to this. And then at the time, I was also taking walks every day, like when it would warm up towards noon, I would go out and walk on the beach. And on one of those walks, all of a sudden I heard a voice. And I turned around thinking somebody must have just said that. But I was on a deserted beach in, a very cold spring. So I was mystified, but the voice that I heard said, "Become a healer." Wow. And that's all I heard. And all of a sudden it became like, what the hell does that mean? Become a healer? Does that mean go to medical school? Does that mean, that was an option. You could go back to school for a year. My brother had done this. After college, take all the biochemistry and so on courses and then apply to medical school. So did it mean that? And then I said, well, but healer, there's all kinds of alternative healers. There's yoga and herbs and all this kind of stuff. But it totally became like a mantra to me. And it kind of pushed out all the self-doubt and self-recrimination. And it became future oriented. What does become a healer mean? And so I actually, at a certain point, then contacted my parents because I realized I would never be able to explore any of these things living in this isolated cottage there. So I contacted my parents, and they also, were very supportive. They agreed to let me come live at home, which nowadays for 20-somethings to go and live at home is pretty common. It wasn't so common back then. And they supported me in taking all these. I started to take courses in things like yoga, herbs, encounter groups. I started to, which I'd never done any of these things before. So I spent a good 6 months exploring those things, and I'm really grateful my parents gave me that space. They didn't push me to, you have to find a job and you have to pay rent. They let me kind of heal from that and explore these things. And what I kind of found was, of all of these various things I was doing, what really was grabbing me were these encounter group-like things. People really sharing deep feelings, feedback, things that I wasn't used to doing. And all these techniques like Gestalt and psychodrama. So I ended up going for a 6-month training program to learn how to do these techniques, and then spent several years as a group facilitator leading Gestalt and psychodrama and encounter groups and so on. And that's what ultimately led me back into psychology. At a certain point I decided, well, yeah, this is really what I want to do, and I'll go get a license to do it and the necessary degrees and all that. So that's what led me back into school. And at that point, in my first psychopathology class, first year of the course in my doctoral program in psychology, I learned that what I had experienced would have been diagnosed as an acute schizophrenic disorder in the DSM-2 that was active at the time. Yeah. And so then I really, buried this and didn't talk about it at all to anybody. And I think that was a wise thing. I think in that era, in the 70s, if I had disclosed having had an experience like this, I could have easily been kicked out of the program, both for the LSD and the psychotic episode. And that would have been true in my internship. So I think it was wise to just totally bury it. But then about 5 years later, I was in Jungian analysis. And in the dream, I was driving in this little car, and I came to this intersection, and there was this big red book blocking my way. And I had to get out of the car and move the book off to the side in order to proceed. So my analyst asked me my associations to this big red book. And I kind of had an immediate association of that holy book, but I was also very hesitant to share it. This woman who was my Jungian analyst had also been my supervisor in my internship, still connected to people in the internship. And I was worried that, if I shared this, it could jeopardize my status. I was still in training. But we'd been in therapy. I'd been in therapy with her about 6 months by then, and we'd already built the kind of container. So I decided to go ahead and share that association, but I used my best psychologist language. I described this, psychotic episode I'd had, and I had these delusions of grandeur. I had this auditory hallucination. I was trying to show that I had this distance from it, but I shared the story. And afterwards, she said, well, that doesn't sound crazy to me. It sounds like that was a really important turning point in your life. And she invited me to bring that book in to my session next time, which I did. And we actually didn't do much work on it, but all of a sudden, I pulled it out of this box where I buried it. And it started me to think that, that's as a valid expression of my unconscious as my dreams. I was still going to work with my dreams, but this book was also my unconscious speaking to me. So it set me, thinking about it very, very differently. And then later I did some work with a Native American medicine man named Wallace Black Elk. And as part of that work, we did an all-night peyote ceremony without peyote. It was it was at a retreat center, so it was done in the teepee. We fasted all day. There was a drummer doing the standard peyote drum beats, and we had a fire in the middle. And at one point in that ceremony, I started to kind of, flashback isn't the right word, but I started to have a lot of the same feelings that I had had during that 2-month episode of, oh yes, I'm in the right, place in the right time. I have a mission in life, blah, blah. And then I started to get kind of scared, like, oh my gosh, is this all coming back? Et cetera, et cetera. And of course, one of the beautiful things about ritual is that it kind of carries you along. And I was able to focus on the drumming and on the fire and move through that. And in the morning, we exited the teepee at sunrise, and I happened to exit, and as we exited, we were walking back to the lodge and going to break our fast with some food that had been prepared for us. And I walked next to Wallace Black Elk, and I just started to share that experience. And he shared with me that in his early 20s, he had been hospitalized after he had a series of visions, and that's what led him to become a medicine man. And he subsequently wrote a book about this with an anthropologist, but he, at that point, didn't talk about it. I'd never heard him talk about it, and it wasn't written about. So that also kind of changed my thinking about it. I began to think of it as a kind of shamanic initiatory crisis that I had that initiated me as a healer. So those were one of the ways. Those are the key ways that I kind of integrated it. Spirituality is now a focus in my life and my career as well. So it really was, in retrospect, my spiritual awakening. And it also met, well, in the DSM-4 and 5, and this category is in the DSM-5 as well, it would be possibly considered to be a psychedelic-induced psychotic disorder rather than schizophrenia. Or it could be considered a brief psychotic disorder. It doesn't meet all the criteria of the current DSM for schizophrenia, but it certainly would meet the criteria for some form of psychotic disorder. So I'm aware of that, and yet I'm also aware it was my spiritual awakening.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that, David. What you described, there's so many pertinent points I could pull out there, but I just wanted to kind of thank you for following your mission, because your work has helped me hugely to integrate my own experience and kind of frame it in a more empowering way than psychopathological illness. But what you describe, you really have lived the hero's journey, haven't you? From the first stage of existential questioning through dark night of the soul and hearing voices, psychosis, any stage could have been diagnosed as a mental illness. But I noticed that you describe what prevented that from happening was that you had validation and you had a peer group, a strong kind of family network and peer group that helped you journey through and kind of gave you safe spaces so that you could make sense of it on your own. And that's what we're finding so much is, the more and more people I interview, there are really strong patterns throughout people's experiences that make the difference as to whether they become hospitalized or not. And I know, your work and your mission is to raise awareness around this spiritual emergence process to prevent people from being pathologized and medicated. And it's amazing the amount of work you've done for that. And I'm hoping to kind of continue and, wave the flag for your work in a way with the work that we're doing for ISEN, and kind of hopefully raise more awareness through this campaign for people so that they can find this more empowering way to understand their experiences. I'm just wondering kind of what your aim was with getting this category put into the DSM, and kind of where you feel that that's going and what your desire is for the future with regards to how this is acknowledged within mainstream psychiatry.
Okay, well, the origins of the category are from the Spiritual Emergency Network, which I was involved with from the get-go. And then in 1979, Stan and Christina Groff organized a conference in Monterey that I was at and presenting and so on, and helped organize. And there were over 500 people. And we had a meeting after the conference, the Monday after the 3-day conference. And, you know, we just had this very successful conference, but we were also very aware it was kind of preaching to the choir. And we were, you know, brainstorming about how to get the word out there about this. And the issue came up of getting a category into the DSM. And Francis Liu, a psychiatrist, and I kind of agreed to explore that. And we worked on putting together this proposal it was about a 4-year process. And part of the process was learning more and more about the DSM itself and how it works and functions. And I had been part of field trials of the DSM-3 when I was on the faculty at UCLA. Francis Liu was also involved in some of the DSM things. So we took this concept of spiritual emergency and figured out that, first of all, we wanted it not to be a type of mental disorder. Mm-hmm. And there is a section in the DSM it's called Other Conditions, which may be the focus of clinical attention. So by other conditions, they mean other than mental disorders. So marital problems, academic problems, many occupational problems bring people into therapy, but they don't have a mental disorder. So that's where we decided we wanted to propose this category for. We were also aware that at the time, even more so than now, but it's still kind of true, that, spirituality is a term that is used to distinguish itself from organized religion. But in fact, organized religion is really kind of a cousin of all of this. And other people have very similar crises around their religious faith and experiences. We also thought it would be a way to there is a committee of the American Psychiatric Association at the time called the Committee on Psychiatry and Religion. And we thought that by also encompassing religion, we might be able to get more support from within the within the American Psychiatric Association, which publishes the DSM. So that was one consideration. And then I did some literature searches, which we published, of everything that shows up in the professional healthcare scientific literature pertaining to religious and spiritual issues in mental health. And I began to see that there's actually a wide range of issues that come up for mental health professionals around religion and spirituality, which spiritual emergency is one, but the most common one, actually, and this is what we published our results on, the most common problem discussed in the healthcare literature is loss of faith. People who are a devout believer of one type of faith who have an experience that leads them away. I worked with a woman when I was at the San Francisco VA Medical Center as a psychologist who was a devout Catholic. And then her 40-year-old son, developed cancer. And she went to church every day and she prayed to one of the saints, but her son died. And she stopped going to church. She was done with religion. And of course, that left a big vacuum in her life. So those are the kinds of things that mental health professionals also deal with. So that's why we broadened it to the religious or spiritual problem. And actually, my work now is broadening that even further. I'm now very involved in the concept of spiritual competency. And we have published 2 research articles in American Psychological Association, peer-reviewed journals on spiritual competency. And we now have established an evidence base for 16 different competencies that every mental health professional should hold in order to practice that pertain to religion and spirituality. One of them is distinguishing psychopathology from genuine religious and spiritual experiences. That's one of the 16, but there's a number like showing respect for your clients' religious or spiritual beliefs and practices. That actually has to be trained, inculcated, because many people, they believe what they believe and other people are wrong. A lot of our fundamentalist Christian population in the United States would believe that. But they can also be taught that, part of mental health services is to respect the client's beliefs, not to convert them. So that's one core skill. Another is how to do an assessment. How do you talk to clients about religious and spiritual issues in their life? And what are their sources of strength from their religion? And things like that. And then conflicts. What kind of conflicts do they have? So there's all these different areas of competency that I'm now actually providing training materials for. I give workshops in this area. I'm giving a workshop at Esalen in January related to this. But, that my work has continued to broaden from kind of this spiritual emergency to religious and spiritual problems to spiritual competency. So I like that because it means that it's now relevant to every psychologist, social worker, psychiatrist, etc. And as part of competency, they, need to learn how to distinguish psychopathology from authentic religious and spiritual experiences, including spiritual emergencies.
That was, it's amazing that you're introducing this more into the mainstream mental health care. And we were talking before we started recording on where you're actually facilitating this training. And that's amazing that it's kind of getting into the educational facilities now for clinicians, which is so needed 22 years after you got it introduced into the DSM. I'm just wondering about your, I know we need to finish soon, but your perspective, David, on the differential diagnosis thing, because this is something that we're looking at within ISEN at the moment, about kind of transcending the fact that there are people who have spiritual emergence and people who have psychosis, and actually we're in the midst of a human evolution, and that the psyche is kind of pushing us to awaken as a human race, and that everyone actually is in some kind of a spectrum of spiritual emergence process. I'm just wondering what your perspective is on that, and whether that's changed from when you first kind of started to work in this field to now.
Well, no, I've always, first of all, acknowledged that there's overlap. Even I published an article pre-DSM that was called Diagnosis of Mystical Experiences with Psychotic Features. And in that, I have a Venn diagram which shows overlap. And in that area of overlap in particular, if somebody is provided the kind of treatment that Soteria and Diabasis provided, you can kind of let them benefit from it, swing it in that direction. If it's pathologized, you're going to bring it into that other domain and create perhaps lifelong mental problems for that person. So there's an area of overlap. I think some people do need some kind of shelter or sanctuary during that period. I mean, I was lucky. I had a place to sleep and people who fed me and so on, but I would have needed something like that because I didn't feel I didn't have the resources, and I didn't feel I needed to generate my own resources. I just needed to, wait a little bit, and it would all fall into my lap. So during that time, if I would have been able to be supported at a place like Soteria or Diabasis, I think I could have ended up in the same place that I am with it. But if I had ended up in a psych hospital and pathologized, I probably never would have been able to go to graduate school. Maybe the medication would have kind of locked in some of those experiences, and my life could have taken a very different turn.
Yeah, and that's the key, isn't it? Is getting the correct support. What would your ideal facility look like, David? If as ISEN, we could create inpatient facilities around the world, a network of support services for people with spiritual emergence, what would it look like to you?
Well, I think there's already a lot of good literature on this, by John Perry and Warren Mosher, who really created very hospitable environments. The only thing they really missed, and this is very important, and I stress this a lot now in my area of work, is the whole, in my doctoral dissertation, I called it holistic health. And I included in my program, meditation, yoga, jogging, nutrition, and so on. And those are so important to well-being. And I think our diet contributes to all kinds of mental states that are very dysfunctional. So I think, those areas of everything like diet and lifestyle, mindfulness practices, they were not part of the culture in the 70s and 80s when diabetes and soteria were created, but I think they have to be part of any solution or any part of any program that really deals with these kinds of things. If you can get people to eat and sleep and exercise, that's going to go a long way towards bringing everything back into balance. And yet, I liked how diabetes and soteria also allowed people's psyches to unfold in whatever way that their psyche was inclined, and really respect the kind of knowledge of the unconscious in that regard, and not try to impede it, but try to allow it to express itself and so on. So those techniques are out there, in many different ways, and I'm not even an expert in them, all the expressive arts and things like that. But certainly one of the things we're covering in our workshop at Esalen is how to be with extreme states without freaking out.
Yes.
The therapist has to be able to hold that space and move with the individual in that space.
Yeah, that's so key, isn't it? Because what you just described, it sounds simple, but it's really not. If the people holding the space aren't able to deal with their own triggers and their own emotions, so yeah, having an integrated approach, but also a staff care team who really understand and are in a good place in themselves.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, I think it's happening, isn't it? It's certainly, all of these strands seem to be kind of coming together, and there's more collaboration happening, which is just amazing to see. And I'm so grateful to you for your work and everything that you're continuing to do in spreading the word. And I wish I could come to one of your workshops at Esalen.
Well, I'm also looking forward to the fruition of your project and getting word out in other ways. It's nice that there's a community of people, like-minded people, who are all working this edge in different ways.
Sure. I think you're the king of emerging proud so far. So grateful to you, and think everybody will be likewise really glad to hear your story, and kind of the fact that you give people hope that they can go through really, really dark experiences and certainly come out transformed the other side is what this is all about. So thank you, and you've inspired me to continue with my mission.
Good, baby. Carry on.
Thanks so much for joining us.
You bet. Good talking with you. Bye-bye.
Bye.